Hello again. If you are here, you are in the right place tonight. Find whichever position your body already knows works best for sleep and settle into it now rather than later, because we have a long, slow evening ahead of us and no reason at all to rush toward it. Turn the light down to whatever level still lets you feel the room without quite seeing it. If there happens to be rain against your own window tonight, better still. It will match the story. We are going back to New York City, to the autumn of 1895, to a city split so cleanly in two that a single carriage ride could carry a person from one half of it to the other in under an hour, past marble staircases and gaslit ballrooms, down through fog and coal smoke into streets where an entire family lived, cooked, and slept inside two small rooms. Tonight we are going to follow that carriage. We are going to sit inside it, wrapped in a cloak lined with silk, and we are also going to step outside of it, into the cold, and stand for a while with the people the carriage came to look at. It was called, in the newspapers of the period, slumming. It sounds almost playful when you say it that way. It was not entirely playful, though it was not entirely cruel either, and untangling which parts of it were which is going to take us most of the night. You do not need to hold on to any of that yet. There will be time for all of it, slowly, in its proper order, the way a good evening unfolds rather than the way a headline does. Right now there is only the room you are in, and the quiet, and whatever this night sounds like where you are. For now, none of that matters yet. For now, only this settling in matters. Let your eyes close if they want to. Let your breathing slow to whatever pace it naturally finds when nobody is asking anything of you. I am going to do the walking tonight and the talking, and you are simply going to come along the way a passenger does, watching the city drift by outside a carriage window, warm inside, safe inside, already half asleep before the story has properly begun. Come with me, friend. Fifth Avenue is waiting, and so is everything underneath it. Tonight we are going to follow two versions of New York through a single night in October of 1895. The night an invented but entirely plausible woman we will call Eleanor Whitfield decides, almost on a whim, to go and see how the other half of her own city actually lives. The textbooks give you dates. The films give you costumes. Neither one gives you the truth of what a slumming tour actually was. Who ran it, who profited from it, and what it looked like from both ends of the carriage window. We will begin tonight inside a Fifth Avenue mansion at the tail end of a 10-course dinner, in a room warmed by two fireplaces and a great deal of candlelight. We will follow one woman out of that warmth and down into a tenement district 4 miles south, where a widow takes in laundry for $4 a week and a night watchman calls the hour in a voice gone hoarse from 20 years of the same rounds. We will end the night further east still, among paper lanterns and tea shops, in a room built to look like something it is not, and somewhere in between all three of those places we will spend a good while simply sitting with the people who were watched rather than the people doing the watching. Because their evenings matter every bit as much as hers, and they rarely get told at all. Most retellings flatten this story into one simple shape. Rich people gawking cruelly at poor people, and leave it there. That shape is not wrong, exactly. But it leaves out the guides who built an entire small trade around staging the poverty their customers wanted to see, and it leaves out the people who were watched, who had their own reasons for allowing it, their own dignity intact underneath the performance, their own nights to get through regardless of who was standing in their doorway holding a lantern. By the time we finish tonight, I think you will see this whole strange arrangement differently. Less like a simple morality tale, and more like what it actually was. A small, temporary bridge built between two cities that otherwise never touched, and everything that bridge revealed about both sides of it. By morning, you will know what a slumming tour actually cost, in dollars, and in something harder to put a price on. You will know what happened in the rooms tourists were shown, and what almost never made it in front of them at all. You will meet a widow, a laundress, a guide, and a young woman pouring tea long after the rest of the city has gone quiet, and I think, by the time their evenings are finished, you will find it harder to picture any of them as simply background to somebody else's night out. Before we go any further, if evenings like this one suit you, if you would rather spend your night somewhere real than somewhere loud, I would ask you to take a moment and subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, and it helps more than you might expect, mostly by letting me know there is still an audience for this kind of slow, unhurried history. If you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you are resting tonight, what the weather happens to be doing outside your own window, what hour it is wherever you are. I read every one of them, usually the next morning with my coffee, and I like knowing how far these stories travel while you sleep. Wherever you are tonight, I am glad you found your way here. Now, let us go back. It is the 9th of October 1895, and on 5th Avenue, above 54th Street, the gas is already lit in windows 3 stories tall, because down here the night is only just beginning. The mansions along this stretch of avenue are built of pale limestone and grey granite, quarried and shipped and carved into shapes that borrow shamelessly from French chateaux and Italian palazzos, because the men who built them made their money too recently to trust that American stone alone could say what they wanted said. Mansard roofs rise into the dark sky at sharp angles, slate tiles catching what little moonlight makes it through the low autumn cloud. Wrought iron fences, taller than a grown man, separate the front steps from the avenue itself, and behind those fences, footmen in dark livery stand at attention beside carriage doors that have been opening and closing all evening, delivering guest after guest in silk and broadcloth to one dinner party or another. A few of these houses have begun installing the new electric bulbs, small and steady and strange after a lifetime of gaslight, and where they burn, the light spilling from the windows has a colder, whiter quality that makes the older houses beside them look faintly antique already, though most of them are not yet 20 years old. Somewhere a church clock strikes 11, the sound arriving a beat late through the damp air, and is answered a moment later by a second, more distant bell keeping its own slightly different time. The way clocks across this city rarely quite agree with one another even now. Decades after the railroads first insisted on standardizing the hour for their own convenience. The street itself smells of coal smoke and wet stone and, faintly, of the horses standing patiently in their traces, blanketed against the October chill while their owners finish their meals inside. Carriage wheels click over cobblestones freshly slicked with a light rain that started an hour ago and shows no sign of stopping. Somewhere down toward Delmonico's, an orchestra is packing away its instruments after a private engagement, and the sound of a single cello case snapping shut carries oddly far in the wet air. Up and down the avenue, similar scenes are playing out behind similar limestone facades. A dozen other dinner parties are reaching their own quiet conclusions at this same hour. A dozen other strings of carriages queued along the curb, a dozen other butlers standing in a dozen other front halls counting departing guests by name. 2 blocks over, on Madison, a much younger set has taken to a new amusement this season, a mechanical piano that plays itself, and laughter drifts faintly from an open window despite the cold. Further downtown, past Union Square, the theatre district is only now letting out its own crowds, actors still in grease paint slipping out stage doors into the rain, and somewhere beyond that, electric arc lights burn along a stretch of Broadway bright enough that the newspapers have taken to calling it the Great White Way. A small preview of the kind of nighttime New York this avenue will eventually become, though nobody standing here tonight quite believes it yet. This is the New York that most people picture when they picture 1895 at all. It is the New York of the so-called 400, a number invented by a society arbiter who decided that was roughly how many people could comfortably fit inside one ballroom, and therefore roughly how many people mattered. It is a world of 10-course dinners that take 3 hours to eat, of gowns ordered from Paris and altered twice before they are ever worn, of children raised largely by nurses and governesses so their parents can attend to the serious business of being seen. but 4 miles south and a little east, on the far side of a boundary that has no fence and no gate, and yet is as real as any wall in the city, a different New York is also getting on with its own version of this same evening. Here, below Houston Street, in the neighborhood, the newspapers still call 5 Points long after the actual intersection that gave it the name was paved and renamed. The streets are narrower, the gas lamps fewer and farther between, and the buildings press so close together that daylight barely reaches the ground floor even at noon. At this hour, well past dark, the amber pools cast by the street lamps only deepen the black between them. Tenement walls rise 5 and 6 stories on either side, brick gone soot dark. Laundry lines strung between fire escapes still hung with washing nobody has had time to bring in before the rain started. The air here carries a different set of smells entirely. Coal smoke again, yes, but under it, cabbage water and privy and the particular closeness of too many bodies living too near one another with too little ventilation between them. Somewhere a baby is crying, has perhaps been crying for a while, in that thin, exhausted way infants cry when the person meant to comfort them is also exhausted past the point of comforting. The intersection that gave this neighborhood its name, where Anthony, Orange and Cross Streets once crossed to form 5 ragged corners, was paved over and renamed years ago, an attempt by the city to erase a reputation simply by erasing an address. It did not work particularly well. The newspapers still call the district 5 Points from habit, and the worst of it still centers on a crooked, overcrowded block the city calls Mulberry Bend, a curve in the street so notorious for crime and disease that reformers have been petitioning for years to have it torn down entirely. A building just off Baxter Street, a few doors down from where our carriage is headed tonight, would be considered a relatively decent address by the standards of the Bend itself, which says a great deal about what conditions inside the Bend actually look like. A night watchman makes his slow rounds along Mulberry Street, lantern swinging, checking doors that mostly do not lock properly, calling out the hour in a voice gone hoarse from 20 years of the same rounds. Somewhere behind him, unseen and unthanked, a street sweeper works a cart through the worst of the gutter muck before the morning traffic arrives. A job the city pays almost nothing for and assigns almost entirely to men nobody else will hire. Somewhere among these blocks, the old cathedral on Mott Street keeps its bell largely silent at this hour, though by daylight it rings over a parish that has served wave after wave of the city's newest arrivals. Irish first, then increasingly Italian in these more recent years, each group climbing a little further up the city's ladder before making room, in these same tenements, for whoever comes next. The building itself is older than most of the mansions on Fifth Avenue, a fact almost nobody riding south tonight in a closed carriage will think to consider. The economics of this contrast are worth pausing over, because they are not abstract. A skilled tradesman in New York in 1895 might earn $12 to $15 in a good week. An unskilled laborer considerably less, often 6 or 7, and women doing piecework in the garment trade, sewing shirtwaists or finishing coats by candlelight after the daylight through the window has failed, might see $3 or $4 for 6 full days of work. A loaf of bread costs about 5 cents. A quart of milk, 8. A cold water flat, 2 rooms, sometimes 3, with a shared privy in the yard or the hallway and no bath at all, rents for somewhere between $8 and $12 a month, which for a family living on $6 a week is not a small sum. It is close to half of everything they make, before food, before coal, before anything else a household needs simply to continue existing. Compare that to the cost of a single Fifth Avenue dinner party like the one just now breaking up above 54th Street. A dinner that, once the flowers and the wine and the hired musicians and the ice sculptures and the extra kitchen staff are all accounted for, might easily run past $600 or $700 for a single evening. One evening's entertainment, for perhaps 20 guests, costs more than a tenement family earns in an entire year of unbroken labor. Nobody at either end of this contrast spends much time thinking about it in these exact terms. That, in its way, is the whole story we are here to tell tonight. Above these narrow streets, an elevated railway rattles past on iron trestles at intervals through most of the night, carrying late-shift workers and the occasional reveller home from Manhattan's downtown districts. Its passing marked less by sight than by a rolling metallic thunder that shakes loose plaster from tenement ceilings a little more each year, and has long since stopped registering, for the people who live directly beneath it, as a sound worth commenting on at all. A newcomer notices it instantly, the way Eleanor will notice it tonight. Everyone else simply talks a little louder until it passes and picks the sentence back up where they left it. A little further east, and south still, past Mulberry Street, the neighborhood changes character again. Along Mott and Pell and a short, crooked lane called Doyers, red paper lanterns hang from wooden door frames, their light softer and warmer than the harsh amber of the gas lamps a block away. This is Chinatown, smaller in 1895 than it will become, home mostly to men, since the immigration laws of the past decade have made it nearly impossible for wives and families to follow the husbands and sons who came here to work. Tea kettles hum behind curtained windows. Laundries run late, steam fogging the glass long after most of the avenue above has gone dark, because a shirt that needs washing does not care what time it is. It is into this second New York, the one below Houston Street, that a certain kind of Fifth Avenue evening will soon be traveling, by carriage, in secret, or in what its participants like to imagine is secret. Though half the city already knows the trade exists, and most of the guides who run it advertise almost openly. But before we follow that carriage south, let us go back inside one house on Fifth Avenue, because there is a woman finishing her dessert in there tonight, whose evening we are going to follow, hour by hour, until the sun comes up on both halves of this city at almost exactly the same pale grey moment. Her name, for the purposes of tonight, is Eleanor Whitfield, and she is 34 years old. Though she stopped mentioning her age in most company sometime around 30, the way women of her set generally do, she is, like nearly every person we will meet in this kind of composite portrait, not a single historical figure, but a plausible arrangement of many real women who lived lives very much like hers. Women whose diaries and letters and household account books survive in scattered archives, telling us what they wore, what they ate, what they worried about, and, in a few surprising cases, what they thought about an evening very much like the one we are about to spend with her. She is the wife of Charles Whitfield, a partner in a Wall Street trust company whose name appears in small respectable type near the bottom of several bank boards and one railroad's finance committee. They have been married 12 years. She wears his ring on her left hand and, on formal evenings like tonight, a diamond and pearl necklace that was his mother's before it was hers, a small weight at the base of her throat she stopped noticing years ago. Eleanor herself did not begin life on Fifth Avenue. She was raised several rungs lower on this same social ladder, the daughter of a prosperous dry goods merchant whose fortune, while comfortable, would have struck most of tonight's dinner guests as modest, and her marriage to Charles 12 years ago represented, by the standards of both families, a genuine step upward, the kind of match her own mother still mentions with quiet, satisfied pride at every opportunity. Eleanor rarely thinks about this fact directly, but it sits underneath a great deal of how carefully she manages her household, her calls, her committees, a residual awareness that her place in this world was earned through marriage rather than simply inherited, and must therefore, in some unspoken way, continue to be earned. Charles himself is a careful, somewhat humorless man of 41, devoted to his ledgers and his railroad committee, and, in his own reserved way, to his wife, though affection between them has settled long ago into something closer to companionable habit than the ardour of their first married years. He is, at this hour, still downstairs with the other gentlemen, discussing rail freight rates over cigars, entirely unaware that his wife is about to spend the coming hours somewhere he would never sanction. They have 2 children. Henry is 9, already away at a small preparatory school 2 mornings a week and tutored the rest, a serious boy who has recently developed an intense private interest in the mechanics of steam locomotives that his father finds faintly amusing and his mother finds, privately, rather endearing. Alice is 6, still mostly in the care of her governess, Miss Prentice. A quiet young Englishwoman, Eleanor, chose herself 3 years ago and has never once regretted choosing. Miss Prentice herself lives on the top floor of the house in a small room considerably plainer than anything belonging to the family she serves, and sends most of her own modest wages home to a widowed mother in Yorkshire, a fact Eleanor knows only because it slipped out once, briefly, during a conversation about something else entirely, and was never mentioned again by either of them. The household beyond the family numbers 11, which is by no means an unusually large staff for a house of this size on this street. There is Simmons, the butler, who has been with the family longer than the children have been alive, and who runs the house with an economy of gesture Eleanor has come to rely on more than she likes to admit. There is Mrs. Dunleavy in the kitchen, a cook of considerable skill and considerable temper, both of which Eleanor has learned to work around rather than confront. There is a lady's maid, named Odette French, by birth and by insistence, who dresses Eleanor's hair each evening with a patience that borders on the monastic. There are housemaids, a footman, a coachman named Patrick, who has driven this family's carriages for going on 9 years, and a stable boy who sleeps above the horses and whose name Eleanor is faintly embarrassed to realize she has never once asked. This is the structure her days are built inside, and it is, by any honest measure, a life of considerable ease. She does not cook. She does not clean. She does not, in any practical sense, raise her own children, though she loves them with an intensity that sometimes surprises her, arriving at odd hours, watching Alice sleep, or Henry frown over a page of Latin he does not yet know he will one day be grateful to have learned. What fills her days instead is a different kind of labor entirely, one that rarely gets named as labor at all, because it produces nothing you can hold in your hand. There are calls to pay and calls to receive, on precisely calibrated afternoons, in precisely calibrated order, because the order in which a woman calls on her acquaintances says something about where she believes each of them sits relative to her. And getting that order wrong is the kind of mistake that gets discussed for weeks. There are committees, charitable ones mostly, for the Orphan Asylum Society or the Working Girls Society, where women like Eleanor raise money for causes they rarely see up close and never with their own hands. There is correspondence, an almost endless correspondence, invitations extended and accepted, and occasionally, delicately, declined. There is the management of Simmons and Mrs. Dunleavy and Odette and all the rest, which, despite appearances, is itself a kind of full-time occupation. A constant quiet diplomacy between people who depend on each other and rarely speak plainly about it. And there is the entertaining itself, the dinners and the at-homes and the musical evenings, each one a small production requiring weeks of planning that nobody outside the house will ever see or credit. Planning Eleanor does with genuine skill, though it would never occur to her to call it a skill, only a duty. One small thing about her that has nothing to do with any of this. She reads novels, English ones mostly, later than she should, by a single lamp after Charles has gone to sleep, and she has developed over the past year a private, slightly guilty fondness for the sensational serialized fiction the respectable papers pretend not to run. Stories of disguise and secret identity and characters slipping unnoticed between social worlds that are not their own. She has never told anyone this. She suspects, correctly, that it says something about her that she is not entirely comfortable examining too closely. Tonight has been, by the standards of her calendar, an entirely ordinary evening. 10 guests for dinner, a menu Mrs. Dunleavy has been preparing since Tuesday, a new French wine Charles was eager to serve, a string quartet hired for the hour after dinner while the gentlemen finish their cigars in the smoking room and the ladies retire to the drawing room to do what ladies retire to drawing rooms to do, which is to say, mostly to wait. The meal itself ran, as these meals do, to 10 courses in just past 3 hours, beginning with a clear turtle soup and moving, with the unhurried inevitability of a ceremony through terrapins stewed in cream and sherry. A fish course dressed in a sauce Mrs. Dunleavy guards the recipe for, as though it were a state secret. A saddle of mutton, a canvasback duck roasted rare and carved at the sideboard by Simmons himself. A frozen orange sorbet meant only to clear the palate before the next course arrived, and finally a dessert of spun sugar and hothouse grapes that took the kitchen the better part of a day to assemble and perhaps 4 minutes to eat. Between each course the conversation turned, predictably, to the subjects that always fill a table like this one. A cousin's engagement, the state of the new opera house, a rumour about a bank across town. Nothing urgent, nothing unkind, nothing that required Eleanor's full attention, which she found herself, more than once tonight, unable to give it anyway. The dining room itself holds its heat the way these rooms are built to, heavy damask curtains drawn against the October chill, the gas turned down low enough that the room glows amber rather than bright. Candlelight doing most of the actual work of illumination along the table's length. The air carries the mingled smell of beeswax from the polished sideboard, rosewater from the finger bowls set beside each place, and the particular richness of a kitchen that has been cooking since dawn for exactly this one meal. It is, by any reasonable measure, a beautiful room to sit in, and Eleanor has sat in rooms very much like it several hundred times in her adult life, which is precisely the trouble. There is a kind of boredom that only comes from comfort maintained without interruption for years on end, a restlessness with no obvious cause and no obvious cure, and Eleanor has felt it building in her, quietly, for longer than she has been willing to admit even to herself. The etiquette that governs an evening like this one, who speaks to whom, in what order, about which subjects, is not oppressive exactly, but it is exact, a kind of suffocation so gentle and so familiar that most of the people wearing it no longer notice it as a weight at all. It is during that waiting, tonight, once the gentlemen have withdrawn and the ladies have settled into the drawing room with their coffee, that the evening turns into something else. Her friend Adelaide Pierce, seated beside her on the drawing room settee, leans in with the restless energy of a woman who has grown thoroughly, dangerously bored of her own comfortable life, and asks Eleanor whether she has heard about the tours. Eleanor has heard about the tours. Everyone, by this point in 1895, has heard about the tours, in the vague, half-scandalized way one hears about things one is not quite meant to discuss directly. Guided excursions, arranged for a fee, down into the tenement districts and the Chinese Quarter, to see, in the words one hears whispered at exactly this kind of party, how the other half actually lives. Adelaide has arranged one for tonight. A guide is waiting 3 blocks away, discreetly, with a closed carriage that bears no family crest. Adelaide has done this before, twice, and swears it is the most alive she has felt in a year of otherwise identical evenings. Eleanor should say no. She knows, even as Adelaide describes it, precisely how Charles would react if he learned of it. Precisely what her own mother would say about the propriety of 2 respectable married women slipping out after midnight without their husbands to look at strangers' poverty as though it were a form of theatre. She says yes anyway. It is nearly 11 o'clock. Upstairs, Henry and Alice are long since asleep, and the small leather notebook on Eleanor's writing desk, the one Simmons fills in each morning with tomorrow's obligations, already lists a 10 o'clock committee meeting for the Orphan Asylum Society, an afternoon of calls, and a fitting with her dressmaker at 4. None of it yet accounts for the hours between midnight and dawn. Those hours, for once, belong to no schedule at all. She goes upstairs to change. Odette is waiting in the bedroom, unsurprised, because Adelaide's own maid has already sent word ahead through the servant's grapevine that moves faster than any telephone line the avenue has yet installed. Eleanor steps out of the pale blue silk she wore to dinner, its bodice still faintly warm from the heat of the dining room, and into something considerably plainer, a dark wool dress with almost no ornament at all, the sort of thing she might wear to visit a sick relative rather than to be seen. Odette works the buttons up the back with quick, practiced fingers, saying nothing about where her mistress might be going at this hour. Because a good lady's maid in a house like this one has trained herself for years not to ask. Over the dress goes a heavy cloak, dark wool lined with a plainer silk than the one she wore downstairs, its hood deep enough to shadow her face entirely once she raises it. Odette unpins the diamond and pearl necklace from around her neck and sets it carefully back in its velvet case, because whatever Eleanor is about to do tonight, she is not fool enough to do it wearing jewelry that costs more than most of the people she is about to meet will earn in a decade. Her gloves, too, come off, replaced with a plainer, darker pair. The transformation takes perhaps 10 minutes, and at the end of it, the woman looking back from the glass is recognizably Eleanor, and yet, in the dim lamplight, recognizably no one at all. Which is, she understands without quite saying it to herself. Precisely the point. Before she goes down, Eleanor stops at the nursery door, opening it only wide enough to look in without waking anyone. Alice sleeps on her side, one arm thrown over the edge of the bed in a way that will leave it stiff by morning, and Henry lies on his back with a book of railway diagrams still open, face down, on the coverlet beside him, exactly where he fell asleep reading it. Eleanor does not go in. She simply stands in the doorway a moment, looking at the two of them, feeling the small, specific guilt of a mother about to do something she would forbid absolutely if either of these children ever proposed doing it themselves, before she closes the door as quietly as she opened it and goes down the back stairs. Downstairs, the dinner party is finally breaking up in earnest. She can hear it through the floor, the small familiar music of departure. Carriage wheels drawing up outside one after another. Footmen calling out names to summon the right vehicle. Charles's voice somewhere below, warm and slightly loud with wine, bidding a final guest good night. Nobody notices two of the ladies slip out through the side door that leads to the mews, where the family's own carriages are kept, rather than through the front hall where Charles is still shaking hands. The rain meets them the moment they step out through the mews, thin and cold, and Eleanor pulls her hood forward with a small, involuntary shiver that has nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the strangeness of walking her own street on foot at this hour. Past the backs of houses she has only ever seen from the front, past a row of darkened stable doors where horses shift and blow in their sleep. Adelaide takes her arm, more for company than for balance, and the two of them walk quickly, heads down, two anonymous dark shapes moving past gaslit windows where other households are only now finishing their own evenings until the shape of a closed, unmarked carriage resolves out of the rain ahead of them exactly where Adelaide promised it would be. They do not take the Whitfield carriage. Adelaide has been careful about that. Careful in the specific, practiced way of a woman who has done this twice before and learned from whatever small mistakes she made the first time. A hired vehicle is waiting a short walk away, on a side street where the family's own coachman will not see it and wonder, an unmarked, closed carriage with a driver Eleanor does not recognize and a second man already seated inside who introduces himself. Once the door has shut behind them and the horses have started forward, as Mr. Daniel Reardon. Reardon is perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who spent a good portion of his life on his feet rather than behind a desk, and he explains, without being asked, that he served for 11 years on the police force downtown before finding that guiding parties like this one paid rather better and kept considerably more civilized hours. He has a low, unhurried way of talking. The voice of a man who has given this same introduction perhaps 100 times before and long ago smoothed away anything that might alarm a nervous customer. He assures the two women, before they have even asked, that they are perfectly safe, that he knows these streets as well as he knows his own parlour, that nothing will happen to them tonight that has not happened, by his own count, to several hundred respectable ladies and gentlemen before them. He lays out his rules for the evening in the same practical tone a coachman might use to describe a route. Keep the hoods up while walking. Speak quietly, if at all, and never directly to anyone they pass unless he introduces them first. Carry no jewelry, no visible money beyond what he himself will collect and distribute as needed, since a curious stranger reaching for a coin purse in the wrong doorway tends to attract exactly the kind of attention the whole arrangement is designed to avoid. Stay close, move when he moves, and trust that wherever he leads them, he has led perhaps 200 parties before them down that same stretch of pavement without incident. Adelaide nods along as though reciting something she has memorized already, which, Eleanor realizes, she likely has. In the quiet after Reardon finishes his instructions, Adelaide leans her head back against the carriage seat and admits, in a voice pitched low enough that it seems meant more for herself than for Eleanor, that her own husband has not asked her a single question about her days in longer than she can remember, and that somewhere in the last year she stopped minding that and started, instead, simply looking for something of her own to fill the silence he leaves behind him. It is not an unhappy marriage, she is careful to say. It is only a quiet one. The kind of quiet a house settles into once two people have run out of anything new to tell each other, and this, whatever this turns out to be tonight, is at least new. Eleanor does not answer with anything so direct, because she is not yet sure herself what has brought her along tonight. Whether it is Adelaide's restlessness catching hold of her the way a yawn catches hold of a room, or something closer to the private curiosity she indulges in her lamp-lit novels, or simply the plain fact that nobody has told her no. She suspects, though she would not yet say this aloud either, that it is some combination of all three, and that whichever of them turns out to matter most by morning, she will not fully understand until she is home again with the night behind her. This is worth pausing on for a moment, because it corrects something most people assume about this whole strange trade without ever quite examining the assumption. The popular image of slumming, then and now, is one of genuine risk, of daring women venturing recklessly into danger for a thrill. The reality Eleanor is riding into tonight is closer to the opposite. It is a business, and like most businesses that survive more than a season, it has been made as safe and as predictable as its operators can make it. Reardon has his regular route. He has his regular stops, some of them arranged in advance with the very people his customers will be paying to observe. The danger Eleanor feels rising in her chest as the carriage rattles south is real enough as a feeling, but it is, in almost every practical sense, manufactured, a controlled dose of adventure sold to women who have very little of it in the rest of their carefully managed lives. The carriage rolls south down Fifth Avenue and angles east, and the houses grow shorter and plainer, and the gas lamps grow farther apart, and the smell through the small gap in the window changes by degrees from beeswax and rain to coal smoke and river damp, and the wheels find the older, rougher cobblestones of the lower streets, and the whole carriage begins to rock in a way it did not rock further up the avenue, a slow, steady, side-to-side motion that neither woman comments on, both of them simply letting their bodies move with it. Patrick, their own coachman, drives smoothly over well-kept paving. This driver, over streets patched a dozen different times by a dozen different city contracts, does not, and the horses' hooves ring differently on this older stone, a sharper, wetter sound, each footfall distinct where uptown they had blurred into a single continuous rhythm. Inside the carriage itself, the small space has taken on its own character over the course of the ride. The leather seats cooling steadily, the little brass lamp swinging gently on its hook with every turn, throwing a moving oval of light across Adelaide's gloved hands where they rest folded in her lap. A folded lap robe, provided by Reardon and smelling faintly of tobacco and horse, sits mostly unused between them. Since neither woman wants to be the first to admit she has grown cold, Eleanor keeps her own hands tucked inside her cloak instead, watching her breath fog faintly against the window glass each time she leans close enough to look out. They pass Washington Square, its fountain dark and still for the season, the grand houses along its north side nearly as fine as anything on Fifth Avenue itself. Though already, Reardon mentions, considered a touch unfashionable by the newest money further uptown. Below the square, the Bowery opens out wide and bright, gas lamps and the newer electric arcs both burning at once, saloons and dance halls and a shooting gallery still doing business at this hour. A strip of the city, loud and lit, and entirely unlike either Fifth Avenue's hush or the quiet the carriage is about to descend into. Reardon does not stop here. This street is not the point of tonight's excursion. Only a corridor to something quieter and, in his estimation, considerably more interesting to his customers than a Bowery already familiar to half the city from 100 newspaper stories. Eleanor watches the city change through the small window and does not say much, because there is a certain kind of attention that takes over in moments like this when you are seeing something for the first time that you have only ever heard about second-hand. Adelaide, beside her, seems entirely at ease, already pointing out landmarks from her previous trips in a low voice, the corner where they stopped last time, the alley Reardon showed her before, and Eleanor finds herself half listening and half simply watching the temperature of the evening drop, both literally, as the carriage's small stove cools without anyone attending to it, and in some less definable way she cannot yet name. She thinks, briefly and a little absurdly, of the sensational novels she reads alone by lamplight, of heroines who slip between one world and another, disguised in someone else's clothes, and she wonders whether this is what those authors were actually reaching for all along. Not adventure exactly, but this specific disorienting sense of being unmoored from the version of yourself everyone at home believes they know. She does not share the thought with Adelaide. Some thoughts, she has learned, survive better if you let them stay half-formed a while longer before you try to say them aloud to anyone at all. It is nearly 11:30 when Reardon leans forward and tells them in the same unhurried voice that they are crossing Houston Street now, and that everything on the other side of it belongs to a different city than the one they left an hour ago. A slumming tour like this one cost, in 1895, somewhere between $3 and $10 for an evening, depending on the guide, the season, and how many stops the party wanted made. Reardon, being a former officer with a reputation to trade on, sits toward the higher end of that range, and Adelaide has arranged tonight's outing for $8, split between the two women. The numbers are worth pausing over, because on their own they mean very little. $8 is, after all, less than either woman would spend on gloves in an ordinary week. Set against the other economy moving through this same city tonight, though, the number changes shape entirely. A domestic servant in a house like the Whitfields earns something between $12 and $16 a month, room and board included, which works out to perhaps $3.50 a week in actual cash. A laundress in the tenement district Eleanor's carriage is about to enter might see $4 for 6 days of work that leaves her hands raw and her back permanently bent forward at the shoulders. The single evening's amusement Eleanor and Adelaide are paying for tonight, an amusement that will occupy perhaps 3 hours of their time, costs more than either of those women earns in an entire week of theirs. This is not a coincidence of arithmetic. It is close to the whole structure of the evening, laid bare in dollars and cents. The women in the carriage can afford to treat poverty as an entertainment precisely because the distance between their income and everyone else's has grown wide enough to make 3 hours of somebody else's hardship feel, to them, like a reasonably priced evening out. There is more to understand here about where that distance actually comes from, because it did not arrive by accident. The dress Eleanor wore at dinner tonight, ordered from a house in Paris and altered twice by her own dressmaker before it fit precisely as intended. cost something in the neighborhood of $400, more than a full year's rent for the two-room tenement flat her carriage is now approaching. The 11 servants who run her household between them draw perhaps $2,000 a year in combined wages, a considerable sum, and yet still a fraction of what the Whitfield household spends annually on coal, on wine, on the upkeep of horses that exist mainly to be admired standing still. None of this makes Charles Whitfield a villain in any simple sense. It makes him a man operating, without much reflection, inside a system that was built deliberately and over decades to reward capital over labor at every possible turn, a system whose logic he did not invent and rarely has cause to examine. Down in the tenements, the same system runs in the opposite direction with equally deliberate design. Landlords, many of whom have never once set foot inside the buildings they own, purchase narrow lots and construct what the trade calls dumbbell tenements. Buildings pinched inward at the center to satisfy the letter of an 1879 housing law requiring an air shaft between structures while packing in as many rentable rooms as the lot will legally bear. Light barely reaches the air shaft's bottom. Air barely moves through it at all. A family paying $10 a month for 2 of these rooms is in effect subsidizing a return on investment calculated with the same cold precision Charles Whitfield's own bank applies to a railroad bond, only here the collateral is a child's lung capacity rather than a stretch of track. Charles's own trust company sits several layers removed from any single tenement, but the money flowing through it is not so distant from this district as he might assume. Trust companies of exactly this kind finance the very real estate syndicates that purchase blocks like the one Eleanor is passing tonight, bundling dozens of small mortgages into instruments respectable investors are pleased to hold, never once required to set foot inside the buildings backing their return. $1 invested in one of Charles's own funds might easily trace, through 2 or 3 intermediate hands, straight back to the rent a family like the one in that lamplit window upstairs pays every month without fail. Nobody along that chain is doing anything the law would call wrong. That is, in its own way, the more unsettling part of the story. Once a month, a rent collector employed by an agent who has never met the actual owner of the building makes his own rounds through these same halls. And families who cannot produce the full amount on the appointed day-face eviction with very little ceremony and less sympathy, their few belongings set out on the sidewalk for the neighborhood to see. It is a system built almost entirely out of intermediaries, an owner who never visits, an agent who never explains, a collector who simply collects, so that no single person in the chain ever has to sit across a table from a family and decide, in person, to put them out into the cold. The distance Eleanor's own life is built on has an exact mirror image down here. A distance built not from wealth, but from the sheer number of hands a decision passes through before it lands on someone who has no power to argue with it. Back on Fifth Avenue, the numbers behind Eleanor's own comfort break down with a similar plainness once anyone bothers to add them up. Simmons draws perhaps $400 a year, a butler's wage reflecting his seniority and his standing above the rest of the staff. Mrs. Dunleavy earns closer to $300, Odette somewhat less, the housemaids and the footman less still, Patrick the coachman something in between, and the stable boy barely more than his room and board are worth. Add the coal that keeps 11 fireplaces burning through a New York winter, the gas and, in a few rooms now, the new electric current, the feed for the horses, the wine cellar Charles restocks twice a year from a merchant on Pearl Street, and the household's total yearly cost of simply existing runs to several $1,000s before anyone has hosted a single dinner party. Coal alone, at roughly $5 a ton, and a household like this one burning through several tons across a hard winter, costs more some months than a laundress working 6 days a week sees in wages across an entire season of steady work. The French wine Charles served tonight, a case of it, cost something close to 2 full months of wages for a man spending his own nights clearing gutters 6 nights a week for the city. It is not an extravagant household by the standards of this avenue. It is, by the standards of nearly everywhere else in the city, a fortune spent quietly, continuously, and almost entirely without anyone inside it thinking of it as spending at all. And there is a third economy moving through tonight's story that deserves mention now, before we go any further, because we will meet it properly before the night is through. Reardon's trade depends on a small circle of people willing to be looked at, or to perform being looked at, in exchange for money that, however modest, still matters considerably more to them than it does to the women paying it. A tenement resident willing to let a guide bring strangers past an open door might receive a few coins for the trouble. A man willing to lie convincingly on a mat in a room dressed up to resemble an opium den, holding an unlit pipe for an audience that wants very much to believe what it is seeing, might earn $1 or $2 for an evening's acting, more than he would make in an honest day's labour at half the trades open to him. Nobody in this arrangement is being deceived about the money. Everybody involved understands, at some level, exactly what is being bought and exactly what is being sold. What nobody quite says aloud is that the entire transaction only exists because one side of it has so much surplus wealth that watching poverty has become, for them, a form of recreation, and the other side has so little that performing it has become, for them, a form of income. Reardon himself keeps most of tonight's $8. Out of it he will pay $25 to a tenement woman further along tonight's route for the use of her doorway, $1 to the man on the mat, perhaps another few coins scattered among 2 or 3 other small arrangements along tonight's route that Eleanor will never learn the details of, a nod to a shopkeeper who leaves his lamp burning late, a coin to a boy who keeps watch over the waiting carriage so nothing happens to it while the party walks the block. What remains, several dollars clear, is his for the evening, better money by far than his old salary as a patrolman, and considerably safer money than most of what this district has to offer a man with his set of skills. Nobody forces him into this trade. He chose it, the way a person chooses the best paying work available to them, and it is worth remembering, as we go, that this describes nearly everyone in tonight's story, Reardon included, choosing among a narrow set of options rather than freely inventing a life from nothing. For Eleanor, riding south in the dark with these thoughts only half formed in her mind, none of this arithmetic is quite conscious yet. She knows, in the general way anyone of her class and education knows, that the city contains great want alongside great plenty. She has given money to the Orphan Asylum Society. She has read Mr. Rias's book, or at least turned its pages and looked at the photographs, at a fashionable dinner party the previous winter. But knowing a thing and feeling the weight of it are different operations entirely, and tonight, for the first time in her adult life, she is about to feel it, at close range, without the comfortable distance of a photograph or a charity ledger standing between her and the fact of it. The carriage has stopped. Through the small window, Eleanor can see that the street has changed shape entirely, narrower now, the buildings taller and closer together, and Reardon is already stepping down to open the door. The cold reaches her first, before anything else does. The Whitfield dining room tonight was kept warm by 2 fireplaces and the accumulated heat of a dozen bodies and a great deal of candlelight, and the carriage itself held on to some of that warmth for most of the ride south. Stepping down onto the cobblestones of Baxter Street, Eleanor feels the October night for the first time as it actually is, damp and sharp and considerably colder than it seemed from behind glass. And she is glad, suddenly and without any irony at all, of the plain wool cloak Odette chose for her rather than anything prettier. Reardon leads them on foot now, the carriage waiting behind at the corner with its driver. He carries a small dark lantern, its light thin and yellow, and by that light Eleanor can see the tenement walls rising on either side, brick gone black with decades of coal soot, windows patched here and there with paper or rag where the glass has broken and never been replaced. A fire escape zigzags up the front of the nearest building, hung with laundry nobody managed to bring in before the rain, the wet garments swaying slightly though there is almost no wind tonight. Somewhere above, a window is cracked open despite the cold, because the rooms inside are hot with too many bodies and too little ventilation, and the sound that comes through it is a man coughing. A long, wet, unhurried cough that suggests it has been going on, in one form or another, for years. They pass the night watchman first, a stooped man well past 60 whom Reardon greets by name Miss Foss, and to whom he passes a coin without any ceremony at all, the way a person tips a doorman. Foss touches his cap and moves on along his rounds without breaking stride, lantern swinging, calling the hour in a voice gone hoarse from 2 decades of the same walk. He does not look twice at the 2 finely dressed women standing in the middle of his street at midnight. He has seen Reardon's parties before, more times than he could easily count, and whatever he thinks of them, he keeps to himself and to the coin in his pocket. A little further on, Reardon stops before a doorway and knocks twice. A specific pattern Eleanor suspects is not accidental. The door opens onto a narrow stairwell leading down, not up, into a basement flat below street level, and the smell that rises to meet them is damp plaster and boiled cabbage, and underneath it the particular mineral smell of a room that floods whenever it rains hard enough, which in this cellar is often. A woman appears at the top of the stairs, wiping her hands on her apron, and Reardon addresses her as Mrs. Doyle, with the easy familiarity of a man who has stood on this same step perhaps a dozen times before. Inside, the cellar is one low room and a smaller one beyond it, the ceiling close enough that a tall man would need to stoop, lit by a single tallow candle and whatever grey light manages to reach down through a small barred window level with the street outside. Damp washing hangs from a line strung corner to corner overhead, forcing everyone who enters to duck beneath a row of shirts and stockings still hours from dry. The washtub itself sits near the small coal stove that provides the room's only heat, steam rising off it in a way that fogs the room's one small mirror and beads on the cold stone walls before running down them in thin, dark streaks. Bridget Doyle is a widow, Irish-born, perhaps 40, though the years show on her harder than they would on a woman of Eleanor's own class, her hands red and cracked from a trade of taking in other people's laundry 6 days a week for $4, when the work is steady, which it is not always. She lost her husband 3 years ago to a fall on the docks, and she has 4 children still living with her in these 2 damp rooms, the eldest a girl of 13 who works alongside her mother over the washtubs before and after whatever schooling the 2 of them can manage to fit around it. Reardon has an arrangement with Mrs. Doyle, quietly understood between them and never discussed in front of the visitors. 25 cents each time he brings a party past her door, which she allows because 25 cents is 25 cents, and because Reardon, whatever else he is, has never once brought her trouble along with his customers. She does not perform anything for them. This is worth noting carefully because it corrects an assumption that will matter a great deal more before the night is through. Mrs. Doyle does not pretend to be poorer than she is, does not arrange her children for effect, does not say anything at all beyond a polite, tired greeting before returning to the washtub steaming faintly in the corner, where she has clearly been working since well before these 2 fashionable strangers arrived, and will likely be working well after they leave. What Eleanor and Adelaide are looking at, standing at the bottom of that narrow stairwell in their dark cloaks, is not a display arranged for their benefit. It is simply a woman's actual evening, continuing exactly as it would have continued had no carriage ever crossed Houston Street tonight at all. And there is something in that plainness, that utter absence of performance, that unsettles Eleanor considerably more than any staged spectacle could have. She notices the girl of 13 glance up once, briefly, taking in the 2 visitors' cloaks and gloves with an expression Eleanor cannot quite read, not resentment exactly, and not curiosity exactly either. something closer to a weary, practiced neutrality. The look of someone who has learned that being looked at by people like Eleanor changes nothing whatsoever about the work still waiting in. The tub. Adelaide, beside her, murmurs something about how remarkable it all is, how she had read about conditions like these but never quite believed them, and Reardon nods along in the manner of a man agreeing with a customer whose satisfaction he depends on. Eleanor says nothing. She is thinking, though she would find it difficult to put precisely into words, about the cost of tonight's dinner party sitting somewhere in the neighborhood of $600 or $700, and about the 25 cents just now passed discreetly into Mrs. Doyle's reddened hand, and about the strange arithmetic that makes both of those numbers feel, from where she is standing, entirely unremarkable. One of the younger Doyle boys, no more than 5, appears briefly in the doorway behind his sister, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar voices, and studies the two visitors with the frank, unguarded curiosity only a small child still has left in him. He says nothing. His sister draws him back inside by the shoulder before he can, murmuring something in a low voice that Eleanor cannot quite catch but understands well enough anyway. A version of the same instruction every mother in every class of this city gives a child at some point. Do not stare, do not embarrass us, let the strangers finish their business and go. They climb back up into the street. The rain has thickened slightly, and it drums a soft, steady pattern against the brim of Reardon's hat as he leads them further along Baxter Street before turning east, past a corner where 3 boys, none of them older than 10, sit huddled together beneath an awning despite the hour, awake because the rooms they share with their families are too hot, too crowded, or too loud with their fathers' voices to make sleep worth attempting yet. Past a shuttered pushcart, its owner already gone home for the night, wheels resting in a puddle that reflects the nearest gas lamp in a long, wavering amber line. Past a saloon on the corner, its windows fogged with heat and noise. A fiddle playing something quick and slightly out of tune, men's voices raised in the easy good humor of Saturday night, though tonight is in fact a Wednesday, a fact that seems to matter to nobody inside. A little further on, they pass a bakery already lit from within, its ovens fired since well before midnight, so that the morning's bread will be ready by 5. The smell of yeast and coal heat drifting out through a half-open door into the wet street. A young apprentice, no older than 14, carries a tray of dough past the window, sleeves rolled despite the cold, sweat visible even at this distance and this hour. He does not look out at the street. He has, presumably, seen a great many closed carriages and curious visitors pass this same window before, and none of them have ever once come inside to buy anything at this hour, so there is little reason to look. The street sweeper Eleanor noticed earlier from a distance turns out, up close, to be an older Italian man named Salvatore, whom Reardon greets with the same easy familiarity he showed Mr. Foss, and who pauses his cart just long enough to nod at the 2 visitors before returning to the gutter, working his broom in long, patient strokes to clear a night's accumulation of mud and refuse before the morning's foot traffic arrives. He has done this work 6 nights a week for 11 years, for wages the city considers barely worth publishing, and he does it, as far as Eleanor can tell from 30 feet away, without any visible resentment at all. Only the steady, unhurried competence of a man who has made his peace with an unglamorous trade a long time ago. Salvatore came to this country 8 years ago from a small town outside Naples, following a brother who had come before him, and written back that there was work here for anyone willing to take whatever was offered. He sends most of his wages home twice a year in careful installments toward a debt his family owes on a small plot of land, and he has calculated, more than once, on quiet nights exactly like this one, that he is perhaps 6 years from clearing it entirely. He does not know Eleanor's name, and will not think of her again after tonight. One more well-dressed shape passing through his gutter on someone else's arm, gone as quickly as it appeared. 1 floor above a shuttered grocer's shop nearby, A window stands open despite the hour and the cold, and by its lamplight Eleanor can make out an entire family, mother, father, and what looks like 3 children old enough to hold a needle, bent over a great pile of unfinished garment work spread across a table too small for the task. Finishing buttonholes and hems on coats destined for a department store far uptown that will sell them in a few weeks for considerably more than this family is being paid to make them. This is piecework, paid by the completed garment rather than the hour, which means the only way to earn enough to matter is to work as many hours as the body will permit, often past midnight, often before dawn. The entire family drafted into the effort because one pair of hands alone cannot possibly produce enough finished pieces to cover the rent. Adelaide, who has talked easily and often since the carriage first crossed Houston Street, goes quiet at this window in a way she did not go quiet at Mrs. Doyle's cellar door, and Eleanor notices it without remarking on it. Perhaps a stranger's poverty is easier to hold at arm's length when it is presented to you deliberately, framed by a guide's lantern and a guide's practiced narration, than when you simply happen upon it unstaged, 3 children bent over needlework at midnight, because nobody arranged for you to see it that way. Adelaide recovers quickly enough, falling back into her earlier easy manner within a few steps, but the pause was real, and Eleanor files it away alongside everything else she is quietly collecting tonight, without yet knowing what she intends to do with any of it. It occurs to Eleanor, watching this window from the street below, that she has spent an entire evening searching for the poverty she came to see, when it has been working steadily, visibly, all around her this whole time, never once staged for her benefit, never once pausing to be looked at, simply continuing because it has to. It is close to 1 in the morning when Reardon tells them, in the same unhurried voice he has used all evening, that there is one more stop worth making before the tour is through. Somewhere he thinks 2 respectable ladies will find considerably more colourful than a laundress's cellar. Somewhere with red lanterns and tea and, if they are lucky, a genuine opium den. Now, the trade Reardon practices, and the world of rules he and his customers are moving through tonight, deserve their own unhurried explanation before we follow him any further. Men like Reardon were, by 1895, a recognized and faintly respectable feature of New York nightlife, enough so that some of them advertised in the very newspapers that occasionally editorialized against the practice. Many, like him, were former police officers, which gave them 2 things a customer valued highly: a genuine knowledge of which streets were safe to walk after dark, and a badge of authority that made both the tenement residents and the local toughs inclined to leave his parties alone. The most famous of these guides, a Bowery character who called himself the mayor of Chinatown and built a small career out of leading exactly this sort of party through Mott and Pell streets, was known to charge visiting parties a flat fee and separately arrange the evening's more dramatic sights well in advance, a practice Reardon has clearly learned from, whether he ever met the man or simply absorbed the method second-hand. It was, by any reasonable definition, a business like any other, built on repeat customers, word of mouth among the right hostesses, and a product carefully tailored to what those customers wanted to feel rather than to what was strictly, literally true. A trade like this survives only with a certain amount of official looking away, and this city has, for decades, been unusually skilled at looking away from whatever pays. The political machine that runs most of this district's precinct politics has long since learned to treat vice as a resource to be managed rather than a crime to be stopped, collecting its own quiet share from saloons, gambling rooms, and the informal arrangements that keep a trade like Reardon's running smoothly. A guide bringing paying customers through Chinatown at midnight rarely finds himself troubled by the police, not because the practice is strictly legal, but because nobody with the standing to stop it has much reason to bother. Reform will eventually push hard against exactly this kind of tolerance, and Mr. Roosevelt's own midnight walks are part of that push, but tonight the old arrangement still holds. Comfortable and unexamined, the way most arrangements do, until somebody finally decides to examine them. What made that product possible in the first place was a set of health and housing conditions that were not incidental to this story, but central to it. The block Eleanor and Adelaide have just walked through sits within a district that a health department survey conducted a few years earlier found to be more densely populated, family for family, room for room, than the most crowded neighbourhoods of London or Bombay, a fact Mr. Rees's own book made a point of putting in front of readers who preferred not to think about it. Tuberculosis moves through buildings like Mrs. Doyle's with a steadiness that public health officers have taken to calling, grimly, the tenant's disease, spread by air that has nowhere to go and lungs that never quite recover between one damp winter and the next. A child born in this district in 1895 has a considerably harder set of odds ahead of it than a child born above 54th Street, and everyone involved. Landlords, health inspectors, guides and tourists alike understands this at some level even when nobody says it plainly. There is schooling too, or the thin version of it available here. A child in this district who attends class at all is likely doing so in a public school built for far fewer students than it holds, sitting 3 to a desk meant for 2, taught by an overworked instructor with little time to notice which of her pupils have not eaten breakfast. Many children leave earlier than the law technically allows, working papers obtained through small deceptions about their age, because a family's monthly arithmetic rarely balances without every set of hands old enough to hold a needle or push a broom contributing something toward the rent. Eleanor's own children study Latin and mathematics with private tutors in a quiet, well-heated schoolroom on the 3rd floor of her own house. The distance between that schoolroom and the one a few blocks from where she is standing tonight is, in its own way, as wide as the distance between her dinner table and Mrs. Doyle's washtub. The Croton water system that supplies this whole city reaches these buildings too, technically. But the pressure rarely climbs high enough to serve anything above the 2nd floor with any reliability, which means families on the upper stories carry their water up by hand, bucket by bucket, several times a day, an unglamorous labour that never once appears in anyone's account of a slumming tour because there is nothing dramatic to look at in a woman climbing stairs with a full pail. Infant mortality in a district like this one runs to something close to 1 child in 5 before the age of 2, a figure so far removed from what a family on 5th Avenue would consider ordinary that Eleanor, were she to hear it spoken aloud tonight, would likely assume it had been exaggerated for effect. It has not been. Doctors who work these blocks will tell you, plainly and without much drama, that rickets, cholera infantum, and a dozen diseases considered nearly eradicated further uptown remain a routine feature of childhood down here. Not because the medicine to prevent them does not exist, but because clean water, sufficient food, and breathable air are themselves a kind of medicine this district has never been permitted enough of. The old cathedral on Mott Street we mentioned earlier runs its own quiet relief effort alongside its Sunday services, a modest fund for widows and the sick that depends almost entirely on the small weekly offerings of a parish that has very little to spare in the first place. Poor families giving what they can to help families slightly poorer still. It is a smaller, plainer version of the charitable work Eleanor performs through the Orphan Asylum Society, minus the printed programs and the fashionable luncheons, and it likely does at least as much practical good, delivered by people who live inside the same walls as those they are helping, rather than visiting them once a season from several miles away. There is a second set of rules worth understanding alongside the health of the district, and these concern Eleanor herself rather than anyone she has met tonight. The newspapers that occasionally editorialize against Reardon's trade reserve a particular disapproval for the women who take it, more than the men, describing them in terms that hover somewhere between scandal and pity. Ladies who have apparently grown so idle in their comfort that watching genuine hardship has become a form of amusement. There is something to that criticism, and Eleanor would likely admit as much if pressed. But the same code that permits a man of Charles's standing to visit a private club a racetrack, or considerably rougher entertainment without a second thought, offers his wife almost nothing comparable. No institution built for her own restlessness. No accepted outlet for whatever private curiosity or private boredom accumulates across a decade of correctly managed afternoons. A tour like tonight's exists, in part, precisely because the women taking it have so few other doors available to them. There is more to understand here about the women making this journey tonight too, because Eleanor and Adelaide are not unusual in wanting to make it. Slumming had become, by the middle of the decade, something of a fashionable minor scandal among women of their set, discussed in low voices at exactly the kind of dinner party the two of them left behind them an hour ago. And the newspapers had taken to writing about it with a tone of theatrical disapproval that likely did more to advertise the practice than discourage it. A respectable married woman venturing into the tenements after midnight without her husband sat right at the edge of what her social code permitted, daring enough to feel like an adventure, contained enough, with a guide like Reardon managing every step, that it rarely cost a woman her standing the following morning. It is worth setting this trade beside another kind of visitor these same streets receive, because the contrast matters. A few blocks from where Eleanor is standing tonight, on Rivington Street, a settlement house has been operating since the end of the previous decade, staffed by young college-educated women who have chosen, not for one evening, but for months or years at a stretch, to live inside this district and work directly with its families, teaching English classes, running clinics for infants, agitating quietly and sometimes not so quietly for better housing laws. These women, too, cross the same boundary at Houston Street that Eleanor's carriage crossed tonight. They ask, in a sense, the same question Eleanor is beginning to ask herself in the back of that basement stairwell, how the other half actually lives. But they ask it as a beginning, rather than as an evening's diversion. And the difference between those two motives, arriving at the same tenement door for entirely different reasons, is one of the quieter, more uncomfortable truths sitting underneath tonight's whole excursion. Eleanor does not know, standing where she is standing right now, that this second kind of crossing exists at all. She knows only her own version of tonight, the cold, the lantern light, Mrs. Doyle's reddened hands, the coin passed so casually into them. Whatever she makes of all this will have to wait, because Reardon is already moving again, leading them east toward Mott Street, toward the sound of a tea kettle somewhere ahead and the first faint red glow of a paper lantern hung low over a wooden doorway. Mott Street feels different from the moment they turn onto it, the change announced first by smell rather than sight. Jasmine tea and hot oil replacing the cabbage and coal smoke of the last several blocks. Paper lanterns hang at intervals along the shop fronts, painted red. Their light softer and warmer than gas, throwing long amber shapes across wet paving stones that here have been swept more carefully than the streets behind them. Reardon leads the two women down Doyers Street, a short, sharply bent lane the police themselves have taken to calling the Bloody Angle for reasons he explains with evident relish, a name earned by more than one ambush carried out where the street turns blind, though tonight it holds nothing more dangerous than the sound of their own footsteps and a cat picking its way along a windowsill above them. Chinatown in 1895 is still small, no more than a few thousand residents pressed into a handful of streets, and overwhelmingly male, a fact that traces back directly to immigration laws passed over the previous decade that made it nearly impossible for wives and daughters to join husbands and fathers already settled here. Whole lives are being lived out in this small district by men who have not seen their families in 10 or 15 years and, under the current laws, have little reasonable prospect of doing so again. Reardon does not dwell on this. It is not the part of the evening his customers have paid to hear about. Reardon pauses at the corner just before Doyers Street bends out of sight and exchanges a brief word and what looks like a folded bill with a man standing quietly near a doorway who nods once and steps back to let the party pass. It is a small transaction, over almost before Eleanor registers it happened, a toll paid to whichever local association keeps informal order along this stretch tonight. Insurance against the kind of trouble a guide's reputation alone cannot always guarantee against. Reardon offers no explanation, and Adelaide, evidently used to this small ritual from her earlier visits, does not ask for one. What he also does not mention is the quiet system of mutual aid that holds this small community together in the absence of nearly everything a family would ordinarily provide. A benevolent association, organized along lines of shared home district back across the ocean, lends money to new arrivals, settles disputes that neither side wants brought before an American court, and buries the dead when a man dies this far from anyone who might otherwise have claimed him. It is not charity in the sense the Orphan Asylum Society practices it, ladies distributing goodwill from a comfortable distance. It is closer to a second, informal government built by necessity out of people the actual government has taken considerable trouble to keep apart from their own wives and children. He brings them first into a tea shop on Pell Street, low-ceilinged and warm, thick with the smell of jasmine and tobacco smoke, where a handful of men sit at small tables playing a game with tiles Eleanor does not recognize, their conversation low and unhurried in a language that rises and falls in a music entirely unlike anything on Fifth Avenue. One of the older men glances up as the two women enter, studies them for a moment with an expression closer to mild curiosity than alarm, and returns to his tiles without comment, the way a man returns to his newspaper when someone unremarkable walks past his window. Whatever these visitors are here for, his own evening clearly has more pressing business in front of it. Behind the counter, a young woman, perhaps 19, is refilling kettles from an enormous iron pot kept always at the boil, moving between the tables with the quiet efficiency of someone who has been on her feet since well before the dinner Eleanor sat down to 7 hours ago and will likely remain on them for several hours yet. We do not know her actual name, because no ledger from a shop like this one has survived to tell us, so we will call her May. And we will allow ourselves 3 honest guesses about how she came to be standing behind that counter tonight, since the truth is almost certainly one of them. Perhaps she was born right here on Pell Street, one of the very few daughters of the very few families the exclusion laws did not manage to keep apart, and has never known any other home. Perhaps she arrived as a small child, brought over before the newer restrictions closed the door behind her, and remembers a village across the ocean, only in fragments. A smell, a sound, a grandmother's face, or perhaps, least likely but not impossible, she came alone as a young woman, one of a small handful who found a way through the law's narrow exceptions, and built this life for herself out of nothing but will and a willingness to work harder than anyone watching her tonight has ever had to work at anything. In any of these versions, she almost certainly speaks better English than most of the men she serves tonight, having grown up, in one way or another, closer to it than they did, and she almost certainly does the shop's accounts as well as its tea, since the man who owns it trusts her arithmetic more than his own. None of this will ever appear on any ledger or in any newspaper. It exists only here, in the small, unrecorded competence of a woman keeping a tea shop running smoothly at 2 in the morning. A fact the 2 visitors currently warming themselves by her kettle will never think to ask about. Whichever of these is closest to true, her evening tonight has already run 16 hours, and it will run several more before she sleeps. Because the tea shop stays open as long as there are customers willing to pay for a hot cup and a warm room to sit in, and on a night this cold and this wet, there are a great many of them. She does not look up at Eleanor and Adelaide for more than a moment. 2 more fashionably dressed women passing through on Reardon's arm are, by now, simply part of the furniture of her evening. No more remarkable to her than the kettle in her hand. Between one table and the next, for perhaps 3 seconds, she pauses long enough to hold her own reddened hands near the kettle's steam, warming them the way anyone does after too many hours handling cold cups and colder coins, a small private comfort she takes without breaking stride, without anyone at the tables around her seeming to notice it happened at all. It is the only moment all evening in which she appears to be doing something for herself rather than for a customer, and it lasts as long as it takes to refill the pot in her other hand. It is what waits behind the curtained doorway at the back of the shop that Reardon has actually brought them here to see. He leads them through into a small back room lit by a single low lamp, its flame turned down until the light barely reaches the corners. The air here is thick and sweetly scented, a smell Eleanor cannot immediately place, sweeter and stranger than tobacco, and in the dimness she can make out a low wooden platform along one wall, where an older man reclines on a thin mat, a long pipe resting in one hand, its bowl cold and unlit. He does not move much as they enter, offering only a slow glance toward the doorway and back, the practiced economy of a man who has performed this exact small scene for a great many visitors before tonight, and understands precisely how much motion the moment calls for and no more. This room, we should say plainly and calmly, is not what it appears to be, and understanding that changes nothing about how quiet and strange and faintly sad it feels to stand inside it. Genuine opium dens exist in this district, tucked away in rooms far less convenient for a guide to reach and considerably less willing to admit strangers holding lanterns. What Reardon's customers actually pay to see is a careful arrangement between himself and a man willing to lie still on that platform for an hour or two each night, holding an unlit pipe, breathing in air scented with a sweetish herb mixture that resembles the real thing closely enough to satisfy an audience that has, in truth, no clear idea what the real thing smells like at all. The old man on the mat earns, for this small performance, something close to $1 an evening, considerably better wages than most of the honest work open to a man his age in this neighborhood, and he performs it with the same quiet professionalism Mrs. Doyle brought to her washtub an hour ago. Neither ashamed of the arrangement nor especially invested in it, simply a way of getting through a week that, like everyone else's tonight, has to be gotten through somehow. Reardon, standing just inside the doorway, offers his customers a story to go along with the sight. Lowering his voice the way a man does when he wants a listener to lean in, he tells them the old man on the mat was once a sailor who first tasted the pipe on a China run 20 years ago and never found his way back from it. That men like him wander into the district by the dozen every year and rarely wander out again, that whole fortunes and whole families have been quietly ruined in rooms just like this one, up and down these same few blocks. It is, Eleanor senses without being able to say exactly how she knows it, a story built mostly for effect, closer in spirit to the sensational newspaper serials she reads alone by lamplight than to anything true about the actual man lying 6 feet in front of her. The real story, considerably less thrilling and considerably sadder in its own quiet way, is simply a man earning $1 to hold still for an hour. And Reardon's version exists because $1's worth of stillness rarely feels, on its own, like it was worth the price of the ticket. Adelaide watches with the fascinated, faintly delighted horror of a woman getting exactly what she paid for. Eleanor watches the old man's still, unhurried face and feels something closer to recognition than horror, the same tired, practiced neutrality she noticed in Bridget Doyle's daughter an hour earlier, the look of a person performing a role because the role, however strange, pays better than most of the alternatives available to them. They do not stay long. Reardon, sensing the hour, or perhaps simply sensing that he has delivered the evening's centerpiece and there is little to be gained by lingering, leads them back out through the tea shop, past May still moving between her tables, and out into Pell Street, where the rain that threatened all evening has finally begun in earnest, soft and steady, drumming against the paper lanterns and running in thin, bright lines down the red-painted doorframes. The walk back to the waiting carriage takes them past the same red lanterns, dimmer now as the rain thickens against them, past a shuttered fish stall and a barber's window gone dark for the night, the street nearly empty except for a single other figure hurrying home under an umbrella that has already half failed him. Eleanor pulls her hood tighter and says little, turning over, without quite meaning to, the whole shape of the evening so far, the cellar and the cold, the mat and the pipe, the strange arithmetic of coins passed from one gloved hand into others considerably less gloved. Adelaide, beside her, has already begun talking about where they might go next time, as though tonight was simply the first course of a meal she intends to keep ordering. Eleanor listens with only half her attention, unsure yet whether she wants there to be a next time at all, or whether tonight has used up whatever appetite she came here with more thoroughly than Adelaide's own seems to have been used up by it. It is nearly 2 in the morning. Somewhere behind them, May will keep pouring tea until the last customer leaves. Somewhere behind them, the old man on the mat will lie a while longer before rolling up and going home to whatever room he shares with however many other men. And somewhere ahead of them, north along streets Eleanor has travelled 1,000 times without ever once seeing them the way she is seeing them tonight. A carriage is waiting to carry her home. The old man's unlit pipe and May's endless kettle are not the end of this story, only a single frozen evening inside a much longer one, and that longer story is already, quietly, coming to a close around all of them, whether they know it yet or not. 5 years before tonight, a police reporter named Jacob Rias published a book of photographs and plain, angry prose describing exactly the streets Eleanor has just walked. The same airless tenements, the same crowded cellars, the same children sleeping 3 and 4 to a bed because there was nowhere else to put them. Rias took many of those photographs himself, at night, using a new and startling technique, a flash powder ignited from a small pistol that lit a dark tenement room for less than a second, long enough to catch faces that would otherwise never have appeared in any photograph at all. Families blinking awake in their own beds, terrified by the sudden explosion of light, unable to understand why a stranger had come to set off gunpowder in their bedroom in the middle of the night. It was its own strange, uncomfortable cousin of the very trade Eleanor is riding home from tonight, another well-meaning stranger from another part of the city entering a home uninvited to look closely at a poverty its own residents had never asked to have looked at, though this stranger's purpose, unlike Reardon's, was to force the rest of the city to look as well. His book found its way into precisely the kind of drawing room Eleanor left behind her a few hours ago, passed around at exactly the sort of dinner party her own tonight resembled, admired, discussed, and for a great many of its readers, closed again without changing very much about how they lived the following morning. But not for everyone. A reform mayor named William Strong took office in New York earlier this same year, and the young police commissioner he appointed, a restless, energetic man named Theodore Roosevelt, has made something of a public habit of walking these same streets himself at 2 and 3 in the morning, cloaked and disguised well enough that his own patrolmen rarely recognize him, checking whether the officers assigned to these blocks are actually walking their beats or simply sleeping them away in some doorway out of the rain. The newspapers have taken to calling these excursions his midnight rambles, and they are, in their way, a slumming tour turned entirely inside out. A wealthy man from this same Fifth Avenue world descending into these same streets, not to be entertained by what he finds, but to hold his own institutions accountable for it. Within 2 years of tonight, the worst of Mulberry Bend itself, the twisting, notorious heart of this district that Rees's photographs made infamous across the country, will be condemned and demolished entirely, its buildings torn down to make way for a public park. The first deliberate act of slum clearance the city has ever undertaken on this scale. It will not solve poverty. It will simply move it, in the way that such projects nearly always do, pushing families like the Doyles a few blocks further east or north to start the same arrangement over again in a different set of narrow rooms. But it will mark something real nonetheless, a shift in what the city is willing to admit about itself, a grudging acknowledgement that the conditions Eleanor toured tonight as entertainment were also, undeniably, a public emergency. The park itself will be designed by men who have never lived a single night in the buildings they are clearing away, landscaped with lawns and paths meant to civilize the ground beneath them, and it will do some real good, giving children who once played in a fetid, crowded alley somewhere open and clean to run instead. It will also do nothing whatsoever for the families displaced to make room for it, whose new addresses simply become the next generation's Mulberry Bend, crowded in their turn, photographed in their turn, eventually cleared in their turn by some later reformer certain that this time the clearing will finally solve what the last one did not. Further off still, forces are gathering that neither Eleanor nor Reardon nor anyone standing on Pell Street tonight has any real way of foreseeing. The garment workers finishing coats by lamplight in windows like the one Eleanor passed an hour ago will, within a decade or two, begin organizing themselves into unions willing to strike for shorter hours and safer conditions. A slow, uneven movement that will eventually reach all the way to state law. The same anxieties about foreign neighborhoods that make Chinatown feel, to a customer like Adelaide, like an exotic evening's entertainment are already hardening, in other rooms of the city, into a harsher political mood that will tighten immigration law rather than loosen it, making May's own community smaller and more isolated in the years just ahead rather than larger and more settled. History rarely moves in one direction only, and this small stretch of downtown streets is, tonight, standing at the exact center of several different currents pulling against each other at once. Public schooling, too, will slowly improve in the coming years, driven by exactly the kind of reform pressure Rees's book helped generate: new buildings, smaller classes, compulsory attendance laws with actual teeth behind them for once. It will happen too slowly and too unevenly to help most of the children sitting three to a desk tonight, but it will happen, in fits and starts, over the following 2 decades, one small piece of a much larger, slower argument this city is only beginning to have with itself about what it owes the people who build and clean and sew and cook for it. The settlement houses we mentioned earlier are growing too in these same years, drawing an increasing number of educated young women away from exactly the kind of evening Eleanor and Adelaide have just spent and toward months or years of unglamorous daily work inside these neighborhoods. Some of those women will go on to shape housing law, child labor law, public health policy, decades of American reform tracing a line straight back to nights spent exactly where Eleanor is standing right now, on exactly these streets, though for entirely different reasons. The real Bowery character who inspired much of Reardon's manner will go on guiding parties like this one for nearly another 2 decades, growing steadily more famous rather than less, eventually welcoming minor celebrities and even a few genuine social reformers curious to see for themselves what all the fuss was about, before finally settling into old age as something closer to a local legend than a working guide, remembered fondly by the same newspapers that once treated his trade as a minor scandal. Reardon's own future will be more ordinary and less well documented, which is, in its way, the more common outcome for most people whose living depends on a fashion that eventually passes. And the slumming trade itself, Reardon's trade, will not last very much longer either. Within a decade, rising moral criticism, a wave of new immigration restriction sentiment that makes the Chinese Quarter especially a subject of ugly public suspicion rather than fashionable curiosity, and the increasing presence of actual social reformers documenting these same streets for serious purposes will combine to make paid slumming tours seem first old-fashioned, then faintly embarrassing, then simply gone, a curiosity to be looked back on rather than a business anyone still openly runs. Guides like Reardon will find other work or grow old telling stories about the years when respectable Fifth Avenue women used to pay him good money to see how the other half lived. None of this has happened yet, of course, not on this single night in October of 1895. Tonight, the Bend still stands. The tea shops on Pell Street are still full. May will pour tea again tomorrow, and the night after that, for however many years remain before this whole arrangement changes shape. Bridget Doyle's daughter will keep working alongside her mother at the washtub and will, years from now, marry a young man from 3 blocks over and move into a slightly less crowded flat of her own. a small, ordinary improvement that neither Eleanor nor anyone in her circle will ever hear about or think to ask after. For Eleanor herself, riding back north now through streets already softened by rain, this single night will settle into something she carries quietly for the rest of her life. Not quite a lesson, not quite a memory she can fully explain even to herself, but a permanent, faint unease whenever anyone at a future dinner party mentions, in passing, how the poor seem to manage well enough, all things considered. She will not always act on that unease. She will, more often than not, return to her committees and her calls and her carefully ordered afternoons much as before. But she will not entirely forget the cold of that basement stairwell, or the tired, neutral look on a 13-year-old girl's face, or the strange, dollar-earned stillness of an old man holding an unlit pipe. The carriage rolls on through the rain, north toward Houston Street and the boundary it crossed hours ago, and somewhere ahead, Fifth Avenue is waiting, dark now, its dinner parties long since ended, its own lamps burning low. Step back from Eleanor's single night for a moment, and a few larger patterns come into view. Patterns that were true of this one evening and were also, in their way, true of the whole strange arrangement that produced it. None of these patterns announced themselves as such while they were happening. They rarely do. A pattern, by its nature, is something you can only see once you have stepped back far enough from a single evening to notice that the same shape keeps repeating itself. In Fifth Avenue drawing rooms and Mulberry Street cellars alike, and once you have seen it, it becomes difficult to look at either world again without noticing the other one standing just behind it. The first is the sheer amount of quiet performance holding the entire evening together on both sides of every doorway. Bridget Doyle performed nothing, we said earlier, and that remains true in the sense that she staged nothing for effect. But allowing Reardon's lantern past her door at all, 25 cents at a time, without complaint, without explanation, was its own kind of performance. A small daily negotiation of dignity against necessity that she managed so smoothly Eleanor barely registered it as a choice at all. The old man on his mat performed more openly, a role built almost entirely out of stillness. Reardon performed too, the easy authority of a man who has walked these streets 1,000 times, though his own comfort here is considerably thinner than it looks. Nearly everyone Eleanor met tonight was, in some fashion, managing what a stranger was permitted to see, and nearly everyone had good reason to. The second pattern is that distance, in this story, is measured mostly in dollars, and the dollars tell a plainer truth than any of the people involved would say aloud. $8 for an evening's amusement, 25 cents for a family's cooperation, $400 for a gown altered twice before anyone but its owner ever saw it properly, $1 for a night spent holding an unlit pipe. None of these figures are random, and none of them are fair in any sense a modern listener would recognize, but together they form an honest ledger of who this city has decided is worth how much. An accounting done so quietly and so consistently that nobody inside it experiences it as a decision at all, only as the ordinary shape of the world. The third pattern is the labor that made this whole night possible while remaining, throughout it, essentially invisible to the people it served. Mrs. Dunleavy, back on Fifth Avenue, spent 4 days preparing a dinner none of tonight's guests will remember by name in a week. Mr. Foss walked his rounds so that Reardon's paying customers could feel, falsely, but comfortably, that the streets were safe. May poured tea for 16 hours so that 2 women in dark cloaks could spend 15 minutes admiring the lanterns above her counter. None of this labor stopped for the tour, and none of it was noticed by the people the tour was arranged for. It simply continued underneath the evening, the way the foundation of a house continues holding up a party nobody attending ever thinks to thank it for. Salvatore swept his gutter. Miss Prentice, 3 floors above the dinner party, sat quietly with a sleeping Alice long after the last course had been cleared. The bakery apprentice carried his tray of dough past the same window whether or not anyone happened to be looking through it. None of these people were performing for an audience the way the man on the mat was. They were simply working, at an hour when the people their work supports are mostly asleep or entertaining themselves, which is, in its own way, the most common arrangement in this story, far more common than the staged theatre of Chinatown, and far less likely to be noticed for exactly that reason. The fourth pattern, perhaps the quietest of all, is how little actual contact took place across a night built entirely around looking. Eleanor spoke perhaps a dozen words to Bridget Doyle, none of them meaningful. She spoke no words at all to the old man on the mat, or to May, whose name she will never learn, having been given only Reardon's version of who these people are, rather than any version of their own choosing. Watching, tonight, stood in for knowing, at every stop along the route, and the carriage window that carried Eleanor south and home again was, in its way, present the entire evening even when she stepped outside of it. An invisible pane of glass that kept looking from ever quite becoming meeting. There is a fifth pattern worth sitting with too, one that belongs entirely to Eleanor's side of the carriage. Comfort, carried far enough for long enough, seems to manufacture its own peculiar hunger, a restlessness that has nothing to do with want and everything to do with the absence of anything left to want. Adelaide named this feeling plainly in the carriage earlier tonight. The quiet of a marriage with nothing left to say. The quiet of a calendar with nothing on it that has not already happened 100 times before. It is a strange, almost unbelievable thing to set beside Mrs. Doyle's $4 a week, or May's 16-hour night, and yet it is exactly this restlessness, this surplus of comfort with nowhere left to spend itself, that put Eleanor in that carriage in the first place. Real hunger built the tenements. A different, softer kind of hunger built the demand to go and look at them. And the last pattern worth naming is the gap between what people like Mrs. Doyle and May were plainly capable of and what the arrangements around them actually permitted. May could read and calculate and manage a room of customers with more grace than most society hostesses Eleanor knows personally. Yet the law that kept her family divided by an ocean and the narrow economy of Mott Street permitted her only a life behind that counter. Mrs. Doyle raised 4 children alone on $4 a week with a competence that would have astonished the men who run Charles Whitfield's bank. Yet nothing in her circumstances would ever let that competence be recognized as anything other than an unremarkable feature of poverty. Capability in this story was never really the scarce resource. Permission was. Taken together, these patterns describe something larger than one carriage ride through one October night. They describe a city that had built, without quite meaning to, an entire second economy out of the distance between its own halves. An economy where wealth could purchase the sensation of understanding without ever requiring the harder, slower work of actual understanding, and where poverty, denied nearly everything else, could still occasionally sell a version of itself back to the people who had caused it for 25 cents or $1 or whatever the evening's fee happened to be. It is worth saying, too, that none of this ended with 1895. The carriages and the guides themselves went away within a generation, but the underlying impulse, the wish to visit hardship briefly and return home from it safely, has never fully disappeared from any wealthy society, only changed its costume. It shows up wherever comfort grows large enough to feel restless with itself, and it will likely keep showing up, in one shape or another, for as long as cities keep building 2 such different kinds of evening within a few miles of one another. None of this makes Eleanor a monster, and it would be a mistake, I think, to close tonight's story with her cast as one. She is, in the end, simply a woman who noticed her own life had grown too comfortable to feel entirely real, and who went looking, clumsily and at someone else's expense, for evidence that the world was still larger and stranger and more difficult than her own drawing room had led her to believe. That she found this evidence in the wrong place, at the wrong price, purchased from people who had very little say in the transaction, is the tragedy sitting quietly underneath an otherwise ordinary October night. It is worth remembering, too, before we close the evening entirely, that Bridget Doyle and May and the old man on the mat were never simply background to Eleanor's discovery. Each of them was living the main event of their own night, one that would have continued in exactly the same shape whether a carriage had ever crossed Houston Street or not. The carriage recrosses Houston Street a little after 3, and this time nobody announces it. Reardon has grown quieter with the hour, the practiced patter he offered in Chinatown spent for the night, and he watches the streets pass with the tired. Professional attention of a man simply finishing a shift rather than performing one. The rain has settled into something steadier now, less a shower than a fact of the night, drumming softly on the carriage roof in a rhythm that has, somewhere in the last hour, stopped feeling foreign to Eleanor and started feeling almost restful. The sound a house makes when it knows it is nearly time to sleep. They part from Reardon 2 blocks from the Whitfield house, the same discretion observed in reverse, Adelaide paying him the balance of his fee with a small additional coin she calls, lightly, his trouble money. And he touches his hat to both of them and turns back south toward whatever bed or room is waiting for him at the end of his own working night. Eleanor and Adelaide walk the last 2 blocks together in the rain, arm in arm again, saying very little, until they reach the corner where their paths finally divide, Adelaide toward her own house 3 streets over, Eleanor toward the mews and the side door and the quiet climb back up to her own bedroom. Odette is awake, of course, has likely never quite gone to sleep, and helps her back out of the dark wool dress and into a nightgown without a single question, taking the damp cloak away to dry by the kitchen fire before anyone else in the house is awake to wonder why it needs drying at all. The diamond and pearl necklace goes back around Eleanor's neck for exactly as long as it takes Odette to notice her mistress does not want it there tonight before it is returned, without comment, to its velvet case. Before she gets into bed, Eleanor stops once more at the nursery door, opening it the same careful few inches as before. Alice has turned over in her sleep since the last time Eleanor looked in, and Henry's railway book has slid half off the coverlet onto the floor, though he has not woken to notice. Eleanor crosses the room quietly enough not to disturb either of them, picks the book up and sets it on the nightstand where he will find it in the morning. A small, unremarkable act of care that neither child will ever know she performed, and that she performs anyway, because it is the kind of thing a mother does at 3 in the morning when she has just spent several hours learning how very much her own comfort depends on people she will never see again. Charles is already deeply asleep when she finally slips into their own bed, one arm thrown across his side of the mattress in the unguarded way he sleeps only when he believes himself entirely alone in it. He does not stir. He will wake in the morning knowing nothing of where his wife spent the hours between midnight and 3, and Eleanor has already decided, lying beside him in the dark, that she will not tell him. Not because she is ashamed of what she saw, but because she does not yet have words steady enough to explain it, even to herself. On the writing desk across the room, the small leather notebook Simmons fills each morning is waiting, closed, tomorrow's obligations already recorded in his careful hand, though Eleanor has not yet opened it to look. A 10 o'clock committee meeting for the Orphan Asylum Society, an afternoon of calls in their precise and carefully calibrated order. A fitting with her dressmaker at 4. The day that begins in a few short hours will resemble, in nearly every visible respect, the day that just ended, and Eleanor already knows, lying here in the dark, that she will attend every one of tomorrow's obligations exactly as scheduled, exactly as though tonight had never happened at all. Perhaps at the Orphan Asylum Society meeting tomorrow morning, she will find herself listening a little more carefully than usual when the treasurer reads out this quarter's expenditures. Perhaps she will not. She genuinely does not know yet, lying here with the rain still tapping softly at the window, which version of herself will wake up in a few hours and pick tomorrow's version of today back up where it left off. 4 miles south, in a basement flat off Baxter Street, Bridget Doyle has finally banked the fire for what remains of the night, her 4 children asleep in the room's single larger bed, while she takes what rest she can on a narrow cot beside the washtub. Because the laundry due back to its owners by Friday will not finish itself, and she is already calculating, half asleep, how many hours remain before she must be at it again. On Pell Street, May has closed the tea shop's front door at last. The last customer gone home through the rain, and she will sleep for perhaps 4 hours before the ovens and the kettles and the 16 hours of tomorrow begin again exactly on schedule. The old man who held an unlit pipe for $1 has gone home to a room he shares with 5 other men, and is, by now, genuinely and simply asleep, no performance required of him until tomorrow night. Salvatore has finished his stretch of gutter and gone home to a small room above a stable where he will sleep 4 hours before starting the same round again tomorrow, 6 months closer, by his own careful count, to clearing his family's small debt back in Italy. Reardon, his own night's work finally finished, counts tonight's earnings once by lamplight before setting them aside and going to sleep himself, already turning over in the unhurried way of a man planning his week. Which night this coming Friday or Saturday might bring him his next paying party. Under the same rain, across the same dark sky, every one of these households is extinguishing its lamps within an hour or so of every other, rich and poor alike, though none of them will ever compare notes on the hour or the rain or the quality of the quiet that follows. Fifth Avenue goes dark at 3. Baxter Street was largely dark already. Pell Street's red lanterns gutter out one by one as their oil runs low. The city, for a few hours, stops sorting itself into halves at all, and simply sleeps, the way any city does, indifferent for once to who is on which side of which boundary. I do not know, my friend, exactly what Eleanor did with what she learned that October night, whether it changed anything real in how she lived, or whether it settled quietly into the back of her mind the way most difficult evenings eventually do, remembered but not acted upon. I suspect, honestly, it was some of both, the way it usually is for most of us, faced with a truth too large to fully carry and too real to fully set down again. But I hope, wherever you are tonight, that some small version of her evening has found its way into yours. Not the cold or the coins or the strange arithmetic of it. Only the quiet willingness to imagine, for a little while, a life considerably different from your own. The rain is still falling on Fifth Avenue, and on Baxter Street, and on Pell Street, all at once, the whole indifferent city gone soft and dark and briefly, blessedly equal beneath it. The last lamps are going out now, one by one, in houses grand and narrow alike. Whatever tomorrow asks of any of them, it can wait a few hours longer. For tonight, everyone sleeps, sleep well too, wherever this finds you.